entirely new pack of forwards coming on at some point in the game. So what does that mean? Hello and welcome to the Papare.com. We are looking forward to the biggest game that comes across the Rugby World Cup every once in 4 years, and that game is going to be between New Zealand and South Africa. As we all know, two opponents that everybody has been talking about for the past week, and what a final we have in store. But before we go into that final, we'll talk about the two semi-finals as well. That's something we previewed last week. So let's have a look at how well our predictions turned out. Joining me to review and preview is Abdullah Yusuf as usual. Good evening, Abdullah.
Good evening, Shankar.
So let's talk about the semi-finals quickly. New Zealand versus Argentina. It was never a game that I'm sure the All Blacks would probably have more demanding training runs. But as we expected, Argentina just imploded. They had to bring something special and they didn't bring it.
Yes, they didn't bring it for over an 80-minute period, which has always been the problem which Argentina have faced. If you also look at it, they were in the game for about that first 15-20 minutes where they were pumped up for the occasion, but they just couldn't sustain it, isn't it? It was 15-6 with about a couple of minutes to go to halftime, and the All Blacks scored on either side of the halves. They scored, I think, through Shannon Frizzell, and then in the second half through Aaron Smith, and that just completely took the game away from Argentina. And after that, you could just sense their heads going down, and from then on, the All Blacks, they just kicked on. They were in more cruise mode, isn't it? I don't think they put too much effort to pile on the points, but they were in control. And I think it set themselves up very well for the finals.
Yeah, let's talk about that cruise control in just a moment as well as we look forward to the finals. A big factor that is being talked about is the effort, the difference in effort that both teams have put out over the course of this World Cup. But we'll get to that in a moment. But let's talk about that second semi-final as well, Abdullah. What a game it was. It was one of those games that you could compare to a really low-scoring, thrilling cricket match. It was a wet outfield, it was a wet pitch, and when it's a wet pitch, everything kind of gets closer to the lowest common denominator. So the better team kind of gets dumbed down, if you like, a little bit. So that's exactly what we saw happen, and England just turned up.
Yeah, absolutely. And for that first 65 minutes or so of the game, you'd wonder what South Africa were doing, because England were basically doing to South Africa what South Africa would normally do, isn't it? They were rushing up, putting a lot of pressure on the South African offense, not allowing them to get past the gain line, and well as the contestable kicks. England were basically pretty much getting all the contestable kicks in their favor. Again, Freddie Stewart was outstanding when South Africa decided to kick. And overall, I thought South Africa, they looked pretty flat, isn't it? We'll probably discuss the reasons for that as we preview the final. But overall, I thought England, they executed well. They just seemed to want it a little bit more. And up until the 65th to 70th minute, you thought that they would eventually pull it off. But again, that South African bench came and made the difference.
Do you think it was just a bench that made the difference? Obviously, they did. But do you feel that England lacked a bit of confidence that they couldn't go on and just seal that game, especially after Farrell's drop goal?
You could say that, but also I feel the difference was the impact both teams' benches made on the game, isn't it? You saw the two prop forwards of South Africa, the bomb squad, as they like to call them, coming in and making such an impact. Then Kwagga Smith coming in, basically making those bearing runs and making some big tackles. So I think the replacements just had an opposite effect on each team's performances on that particular day. And that probably decided the result, because for the majority of the game, South Africa just seemed very flat, wasn't it? And it was England's game to lose from that point of view. But South Africa, as they have done many times, just managed to nick it at the end.
Yeah, that's what they've done for not just this one, but a couple of other games. The only game they couldn't nick at the end, Abdullah, was probably the Ireland game in the group stage. And of course, the Scotland one, which they won comfortably. But other games against France and now this semi-final as well, they've managed to come and just pickpocket it at the last moment. You think it's almost a game plan of theirs, that they're happy to take a game down to the last round and they're confident that they can deal the knockout blow?
Yes, it's probably that they're confident that they can get the job done, but I don't think they go into a game thinking that they will take it to the very end, because it's a pretty risky tactic to follow. But just they have so much confidence in their bench, isn't it? They have come and they delivered repeatedly. So the starters and the bench, they're generally rotated around as well. So everyone is very comfortable in the roles that they do. But you probably have to feel a bit sorry for England as well. I know a lot of people don't seem to have too much of sympathy for them, but just to lose a game which you dominate for a majority, even more than a majority, about 70 minutes, and just to lose it at a scrum and get yourself knocked out of a World Cup semi-final, you've got to feel a bit for them as well.
Yeah, you do. And they really did manage to turn up a really entertaining game of rugby. And you have to say, there's a part of every rugby fan that feels sorry for a team that loses that game. Unfortunately, this is England, so there aren't many of those. But this is the Rugby World Cup Finals preview, brought to you by Black Knight, encapsulating the essence of the male grooming experience from head to toe. We have some sad news, of course, for our rugby-loving public, Abdullah. I think it's important that we mention that to those, obviously, rugby lovers who will be watching this broadcast. The loss of two legends of the game in the recent days. On Thursday, Mr. Ajit Aberatne, former Trinity Lion, Trinity captain, coach of multiple school sides, national coach, and CRNFC player, Sri Lanka player. And of course, Mr. Suman Navaratnam, who lived to the ripe old age of 94 and who was the fastest man in Asia at the time. So one Royalist, one Trinitian, I'm sure they must be watching the game up wherever they watch games. They say rugby is a game made in heaven, so they'll be watching it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what two wonderful gentlemen as well, is the Chanaka. They've contributed so much to Sri Lankan rugby over the years. Mr. Sumanaratnam, I've had the opportunity of, he hasn't actually coached me, but he's coached so many generations, and now his academy is running as well under his name, which he used to come in a wheelchair and monitor how these young kids used to do it. It just showed his passion for the game. Will be sorely missed. And Ajit Aberatne as well, I mean, one of the most shrewdest rugby brains you'll probably have in Sri Lanka, contributed so much. I think till the very end he was serving as a technical head of Sri Lanka rugby as well. I had the opportunity of being mentored by him to a certain extent while I was coaching CRNFC as well. And a very giving person, excellent knowledge of the game. The thing about those two gentlemen is they just did it for no gain, but other than purely for the love of the sport. So both of them will be dearly missed, and I think everyone will acknowledge their role they have played in Sri Lankan rugby.
Yeah, they absolutely have wonderful contributions from two gentlemen, Suman Navaratnam and Ajit Aberatne. Our heartfelt condolences to their families, and of course we will miss them very much as we go on, and a fond farewell to both of them as we look forward to this game that they would eagerly have anticipated themselves if they were still with us. So let's talk very quickly about the bronze final, the game nobody wants to play, Abdullah. Argentina taking on England. How do you think that's going to go? Do you think England can get themselves up after that emotional low of losing that semi-final?
Yes, the thing is, what both these teams have to get out of the third and fourth place is probably entirely different. If you look at it from England's point of view, they are probably building for the future. So for them to have finished third will definitely give them a lot of confidence going into the future. While from Argentina's point of view, they will want to equal their best ever finish, which they did, I believe, in 2007 when they emerged third. So both teams have something to gain out of it. How motivated they will be, I guess time will tell. But just going by the team selections, there have been a few adjustments by both coaches, but the attitude has been that they would definitely want to try and win that bronze medal and have some silverware to take home with them.
Yeah, third place is no slouch, really. So let's go in for a break and come back and have a look at this all-important final. You're watching the preview on the Papare.com. Welcome back to the preview show of the Rugby World Cup finals here on the Papare.com. We are looking forward to the biggest game in Rugby World Cups. Comes around every once in 4 years, and of course all the fans come out of the woodwork. It has been a stunning tournament, and it was expected going into this tournament it will be one of the most competitive, and I think it has lived up to that as well, especially from the quarterfinal rounds. And we are now here at the final. Only two teams remain: New Zealand and South Africa, the perennial rivals. Abdullah, I don't think we could have asked for a better matchup in the final.
Absolutely. And both teams with such a rich history in the Rugby World Cup, both having won it 3 times each, going for a 4th title. Yes, I think it's going to be a clash of styles as well. Probably both teams in different stages of, in terms of their preparation, in terms of what they've gone through in the tournament. But yes, definitely a final to look forward to.
Yeah, what we will know for sure at the end of this game is that we will have our first 4th time winner of the Rugby World Cup. The last time these two teams met in a final, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember it, but that was in 1995 when the great Jonah Lomu was stifled by James Small, and South Africa went on to win that historic game under Francois Pienaar in 1995. Abdullah, that's exactly what they've done in this World Cup as well, haven't they? South Africa have been a spoiling team. They haven't been a team that's been very creative. They haven't scored a lot of tries, but they've taken every opportunity that's been given to them. They've been kind of scavengers, and rather than Springboks, maybe we should be calling them the hyenas, but they have really done well in what they've set out to do. They realized their limitations, especially after they lost Malcolm Marx. But do you think it's okay, as it were, to have a world champion who plays rugby like that?
Yes, that's an interesting point. But at the end of the day, it's about winning the World Cup, isn't it? And it's something which their supporters wouldn't mind too much. Even if you go back to that Lions tour, which was held in 2021, the rugby wasn't great. But just the fact that they managed to go out there and just win that series 2-1, and dare I say, they got the final penalty with another scrum infringement by the Lions. So they just know how to win these big matches. Just turn it on when it counts. And the thing with the South African style of rugby, it's risk-free, isn't it? And they just don't take any risks. They play the percentage as well. They thrive on the opponent's mistakes rather than trying to create anything and lose that percentage game. So it's a formula that has worked for them. And I don't see that changing in the final too much as well.
Yeah, it probably won't change in the final because we have the South African team. At the time we're recording this, Abdullah, we have the South African team, and not a lot of changes except that they've gone back to that 7-1 split on the bench. So Willie Leroux is the only back on the bench. They've got a bunch of huge 7 forwards to come on. And of course, Damian Willemse takes his place in the starting 15 as perhaps a backup kicker in case that Andre Pollard gets injured. But let's talk this through, Abdullah. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who know exactly what this means, but let's break down what this 7-1 split signifies. You've got almost an entirely new pack of forwards coming on at some point in the game. So what does that mean?
Yeah, I think the way they probably, Ras Erasmus is looking at it is they're not going to outrun New Zealand. So what they probably want to do is be very tight in the breakdown, apply as much pressure as they can, keep the ball tight, and just play that gain line game, just not allowing New Zealand any front foot ball. So you have to do that. You have to have some really good, strong forwards who are able to sustain that effort over 80 minutes. And he probably realized that New Zealand are going to try and run them out wide as much as possible, play the game in the outside flanks. So he's probably very conscious of that, and he's taken a big risk here. You've got to admit that. Playing with 7 forwards in a World Cup final, no reserve scrum half. Read that Chelsea and Colby will be the reserve scrum half if required. It's a massive risk. But it's a risk that he's willing to take. And so far, most of his gambles have paid off. So who knows?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. I mean, fortune favors the brave. You've taken a huge risk. Will it pay off for him? We'll find out, of course, once the whistle blows on the 80 minutes or, if necessary, after extra time. But what it does do also, Abdullah, it allows the starting forwards to just go at an intensity that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do in an 80-minute game. So it's as if you have a whole team who's told, go out there and put you 100% out for 40 minutes. So it's like having a pacemaker in a long distance race or something like that. So these guys can go out there and just create havoc, come off, and know that somebody else is going to come on and do that again for them. Firstly, how do you feel about that as a tactic, as a from a coaching point of view? You've been a coach, and also how do you think that it affects the opposition, knowing that they've got this bunch of behemoths playing against them that only have to play 40. We've got to play the full 60 or 70 or 80, but these guys have got to play only 40 minutes. How does that affect the psychology?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how New Zealand do react to that in terms of their tactics. But again, it's just mind games, isn't it? From New Zealand's point of view, they just probably have to put that aside and just ensure that they play their game. Just ensure that they get their line out right. South Africa's line out hasn't been great throughout this tournament, but the scrum is very strong. So just they have to ensure that they get their set piece right. So far, the All Blacks scrum has looked really strong. Even in that semi-final, they dominated the Argentine pack. It'll be at another level with the South African 8, but they've just shown size that they can cope with that. But overall, I think what Rassie is probably looking at is just trying and disrupting New Zealand's game as much as possible, especially around the breakdown, slow the ball down. So for that, when you keep on introducing fresh legs, that has an impact, because the All Blacks will be looking to turn it on in that final 20. So when you have virtually another set of forwards, fresh forwards coming in, applying that pressure and not giving the All Blacks the front football that they would thrive on, he probably is looking at that to stifle whatever attacking threat that the All Blacks can put out.
Yeah, the All Blacks have shown that they have plenty of attacking threats. They've scored a huge number of points in this World Cup. Will Jordan has been absolutely deadly. He's equaled the number of tries already in a World Cup held jointly by Jonah Lomu, Brian Habana, Julian Savea, and now Will Jordan as well. So 3 All Blacks in that record-breaking group and 1 Springbok. So you can see what kind of World Cup pedigree these 2 teams have, Abdullah. But Sia Khaleesi was at the media conference last week, and he said, it's not going to say whether we won ugly or what happened. It's just going to say that South Africa won. And they're going to be quite happy doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as they're concerned, they just want their name engraved on their title for that particular year, isn't it? And going in as defending champions, they were under a bit of pressure as well. The only thing with South Africa is the lead up to this game, isn't it? And I probably feel the selection of those 7 forwards also has an added impact on that. They've had to play, I think, the top 5 teams in consecutive matches virtually. So they looked a bit drained in that semi-final against England as well. So he probably realizes that he has got to keep those forwards fresh as possible if they're going to compete and stay in the game. That also probably has had an impact on his decision on having a 7-1 split. So a lot of other factors have probably gone into this decision. Rassie has been very shrewd in the way he has thought out most of his plans throughout this World Cup. So a lot of thought has probably gone into that, and let's see how it pans out.
Yeah, that injury to Malcolm Marx early on in the tournament really put a spanner in Rassie Erasmus's works and completely threw the South African plans off kilter. But they've managed to salvage most of it and come back into this World Cup final. But a team that has been purring along ever since that first loss to the hosts France, Abdullah, the All Blacks, even though they've encountered opposition which has been of below par, I think it would be fair to say, they did beat the number 1 team in the world and beat them fairly comfortably. They never trailed in that game. So do you feel that the All Blacks have been looking at this final and targeting and just been on the upward slope?
Yeah, I definitely feel so. I just felt that they're just targeting the knockout phases. They knew that once they'll get to the quarterfinals, and from then on for them the tournament would start. Just going back to that first game against France, if you had looked at that performance, you'd probably thought All Blacks are not going to make it that far. But here they find themselves in the final. They realize that they just have to manage that French game. They need not have won it. Just manage that game. They'll have 3 easy games running into the quarterfinals. And then just peak in time for that. And they knew they'd probably get either Ireland or South Africa in those quarterfinals. So they were probably targeting that. And you just feel that they have smoothly progressed into the knockout phases. And for their good fortune, they just steamrolled a very lackluster Argentine outfit as well. So I think the way the games have panned out, you'd have to say that New Zealand are probably in the ascendancy and are probably peaked at the correct time.
And having said that, Abdullah, you've got physical fitness, which is something that is way in New Zealand's favor. But they've not really had to come through a really tough game in this World Cup yet, except, of course, maybe Ireland, which was a couple of weeks ago. But they haven't really been tested because even that game, they didn't have to come back into that game. They led right through and scored some brilliant tries. And Ireland kind of imploded in that game also. But to come up against a team that's playing really well and to be able to beat them, they haven't had to do that yet. So for me, it's purely a contrast between physical fitness and the mental pressure that the South Africans have been able to overcome. It's going to be a battle between that. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. But I think the All Blacks will also be looking at playing a bit more of a skillful game with a bit more width as well. They've got to take into consideration the weather as well, isn't it? Because if conditions are like what it was in that England-South Africa semi-final, tactics will have to change. And then you have the next set of bomb squad coming onto the field and causing all kind of havoc. But you just sense that this All Blacks team have got their game plans, have got their roles all sorted out. They seem to be very clear and precise in how they want to go about the game. Their game management with Richie Mo'unga and Aaron Smith has been excellent in other than their French game from then on. They just seem to have control over all of the situation. So it'll be interesting to see how they adjust if it does rain, what kind of game they will play. Because if they want to get the better of the South African team, first of all, they need to get good front football. And then after that, launch their three quarters from that. Because man on man, they're obviously much more skillful than the South African backs. So let's wait and see how this game eventually progresses.
My worry, though, Abdul, I agree with you completely that these guys are far more skillful. And if you just look at Will Jordan, he's better than any other three-quarter in the competition, probably, except maybe Antoine Dupont. But the fact remains that New Zealand don't seem to have a plan B. If things don't work for them, if they don't get that front football, if they don't manage to use the quick hands, if they don't have those contestable kicks coming back their way, and if, for instance, say Adi Surveyor or someone doesn't have the kind of game that he has been having in the last couple of matches, then what do? Because we haven't really seen an ability for them to step back, close things up, tighten it, manage a game well, like perhaps the Crusaders do back in the Super Rugby competition. We haven't seen New Zealand being required to do that.
Yes, so far not. Who knows, it could be in their kit bag, which they'll probably pull out when the need arises. But overall, I think most teams, they'll have plan A, which they're comfortable in it. But if things tend to go wrong, these guys are professional players. They probably know how to adjust what needs to be done. Now, for them, having seen the bench that the South Africans have put out, I'm sure they will take that into consideration as well. And scenario plan, because I think that's very important. Plan for certain situations. If this happens, what are we going to do? If it rains, what are we going to do? So overall, I think they probably have most bases covered. But again, you'll have to think on your feet as well. And I think that's where guys who have been there and done it before, the Retallicks, the Aaron Smiths, the Borden Barretts, all of them are going to become so more important. Just making those decisions on how to adjust, how to play. Because as you said earlier, South Africa are just going to come out there and create havoc and tell New Zealand, okay, now the ball is on your court. What are you going to do? So they need to have answers for that. But I think they probably have planned, because both these teams in the Shanaka, they play each other annually, isn't it, in the Rugby Championship. So they know each other's game very well. So let's wait and see. I think overall, it's going to be a close contest. But if conditions are slightly dry, I think we'll probably fancy the All Blacks coming out on top.
So the last match between these two was at Twickenham, 35-7, the biggest defeat that the New Zealanders have suffered at the hands of South Africa. So that psychological advantage is there. But what we've seen about psychological advantages and conceding defeats is that the New Zealanders come out with a real point to prove, isn't it, Abdul? They did that against Ireland. They'd lost a series for the first time in their history in New Zealand against the Irish, and they came out and just decimated that team, and they said, well, that one was for that particular series win. And maybe they'll come out and say, well, you beat us at Twickenham. This is what we're going to do to you in Paris. So there's always that X factor with the All Blacks. They seem to be a team that kind of picks themselves up when people are possibly questioning their worth.
Yes, and especially this last 4-year cycle as well, is that there have been some record defeats that this group hasn't been very proud of. Just reading some of the articles, it's always at the back of their mind. And just the quarterfinals and the semifinals, if you look at it, that home defeat which they suffered against the Irish was definitely on the back of their minds. Losing to Argentina for the first time in their history at a neutral venue as well as home, they just don't seem to have forgotten that as well, because they gave the Argentines a real thrashing as well. So I'm sure that the Twickenham game is at the back of their mind, and I'm sure they'll want to put the score right in this final.
Well, they've righted 2 wrongs. Will they right a third is what we have to find out on when the match comes up in just a few moments. Abdullah, you've picked the All Blacks already. How much do you think by?
I'd say probably between 10 to 12 points if it's dry conditions. I just feel that where both these teams are, All Blacks are probably mentally and physically in a much more better state than what the All Blacks, rather than what the Springboks are, considering the games which they have had in the run-up to this final.
Well, that's an interesting call, because that's a comfortable win that Abdullah's calling for the All Blacks. I'm probably just going to have to even things out and go the other way and say South Africa by a couple if Andre Pollard stays on the pitch for that full 80 minutes. Well, we'll find out pretty soon. Thanks very much to Black Knight for encapsulating the essence of the male grooming experience from head to toe. We've covered this World Cup also from head to toe. Have a fantastic final and good luck to both teams.
Black Knight, make your mark.